Here is today's agenda. We are going to spend approximately the first 20 minutes having some opening remarks from our authors today, William Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen. We're then going to have a time where we have structured questions and answers. There are those who have been reading the book and sent questions and or comments in advance. So we'll start by discussing those topics. And then we're dedicated to have approximately 30 minutes where anyone in the conversation today can then also ask questions to our authors. So let's start with introducing our authors today. First, we have William A. Darity Jr., the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. He has served as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Darity's research focuses on inequality by race, class and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling and the racial achievement gap, north-south theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market outcomes, and economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution, the history of economics, and the social psychology effects of exposure to unemployment. We also have A. Kirsten Mullen, folklorist and the founder of Artifactual, an artist consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Forlorn Ajay Bond Concept Development Team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the Coastal Folklife Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she trained students to research and document the state's African American music heritage. Kirsten was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's North Carolina Legends and Civil Rights Exhibition projects. Her writing can be found in museum catalogs and journals and in commercial media, and includes Black Culture and History Matter, the American Prospect, which examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions. And with these introductions accomplished, we're going to turn it over to our authors to spend time with us discussing some opening remarks as it relates to the books. Can you confirm that you two are not on mute still? I see a mute sign. I think I may need to unmute you. I think I need to unmute you. Oh, there you go.
Yes, thank you. Okay. So I think we'd like to start with a couple of observations. One is that many people refer to slavery reparations, but I think it's critical in the context of our book to recognize that while we view slavery as the crucible for white supremacy in the United States, we do not view slavery as the only reason reparations should be provided to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So in addition to the atrocities associated with slavery, we argue that you must take into account the nearly century-long period of legal segregation in the United States, which was coupled with mob violence on the part of white Americans in a continuous array of episodes that took place both north and south. And you must take into account the current phase of atrocities that are associated with mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, the persistence of discrimination in employment, credit, and housing markets, as well as the immense racial wealth gap, which we are going to talk about a bit further in the conversation this evening. And so there are three phases of American history that are relevant to the case for Black reparations that we advance in From Here to Equality. And I think it's critical that that's kept in mind in the context of the analysis that we're going to pursue this evening. We'd like to emphasize the content of one of the chapters of the book in our remarks to launch the conversation, and it's chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the one in which we address a host of misperceptions and false beliefs that people have about the causes and the magnitude of racial economic inequality in the United States. In fact, we would argue that it is these misperceptions and false beliefs that might lie at the heart of why a significant number of Americans have not embraced reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery as the correct and proper thing that needs to be done. And so we argue that there are three types of misperceptions that people hold. The first is large numbers of Americans continue to believe that there is no significant amount of discrimination and racism that persist in the United States today. Some folks blanket that by making the argument that the fact that the country elected a Black president twice is evidence that there's no more racism and discrimination in the United States. And so that's the first set of beliefs that we are going to argue, obviously, are false. The second is that there is no significant level of economic disparities that exist between Blacks and whites in the United States. So there's a significant number of Americans who actually believe that in some sense the playing field is level, or some of them actually believe that Black Americans are in a better position financially than white Americans. So that's the second belief that we're going to try to address in the context of our second chapter. And then there's a third misperception, which is the following. To the extent that there are any remaining disparities, folks frequently will attribute this to bad behavior and bad judgment on the part of Black Americans themselves. So in some sense, the victims are responsible for their own situation. I mean, in the old days, the sociologist William Ryan would have referred to this as blaming the victim. And we're going to discuss the extent to which Americans do tend to blame the victim in this context and how inaccurate that blaming act is. And so, I'd like to start by reading a portion of chapter 2 in which we provide a catalog of the misperceptions that Americans typically hold. So this is from page 29 for those who are following at home, okay? So we say, a Pew Research Center survey conducted in 2016 reveals the prevalence of these mistaken beliefs. Researchers found that large proportions of both whites and Blacks affirm there is no lingering racial financial disparity. An astonishing 38% of Blacks contended that Blacks are at least as well off or better off financially than whites. Among whites, the proportion sharing that opinion was 42%. In addition, 38% of white respondents believe the nation has already made all the policy changes needed to give Blacks equal rights with whites. A majority of white respondents thought Blacks are treated as fairly as whites in the courts. More than 70% of whites thought that Blacks are treated similarly to whites when applying for a loan or a mortgage, in the workplace, in restaurants, and when voting in elections. Less than 40% of Blacks shared the same views on their treatment in the courts, in seeking a loan or mortgage, or in the workplace. But a majority of Blacks shared the same views as most whites on their treatment in restaurants, 51%, and in the voting process, 57%. Half of whites believe Blacks are treated as fairly as whites in their encounters with the police, but this is a context in which Black beliefs are somewhat different, in contrast with a mere 16% of Blacks. More than 60% of whites did not believe racial discrimination continues to be an important barrier to blacks getting ahead. 47% of whites rejected the notion that lower quality schools constituted an obstacle for blacks, and 55% of whites rejected the idea that a lack of jobs prevented blacks from getting ahead. In all three of these cases, at least 66% of black respondents surveyed thought these factors significantly inhibit black achievement, but that means about 34% did not. However, with respect to factors associated with self-defeating deficiencies in the black community, as important reasons for blacks not getting ahead, white and black respondents held similar views. A striking 43% of blacks said a lack of motivation to work hard is an important factor producing black-white inequality. In contrast with only 30% of whites, even higher proportions of both groups attributed an ongoing black-white gap to family instability, 57% of blacks and 55% of whites, and to the lack of good role models, 51% of blacks and 52% of whites. So while there were sharp differences in black and white perceptions of the role of societal factors in perpetuating racial economic inequality, there was a sharp convergence on the role of alleged cultural behavioral factors.
So continuing on this vein, we are aware that many believe that there are no significant economic disparities between blacks and whites. And so we counter this misperception in From Here to Equality. And I'm reading now, beginning at bottom of page 44. So discrimination persists and is a major cause of the gaps in employment and earnings. Sociologist Diva Pager's landmark field experiments in Milwaukee and New York City demonstrate one aspect of the problem. In a disturbing study involving black and white men of similar ages with similar educational attainment, Pager discovered that white male applicants with felony convictions were more likely to receive callbacks for job interviews and job offers than black men without a criminal record. In another investigation, economists Marianne Bertrand and Senthil Mullen crafted letters of interest describing the qualifications and employment histories of fictional applicants and submitted them to potential employers who had posted job announcements. Who got called in for interviews? The results of these correspondence tests are also disturbing. Applicants with black-sounding names were less likely to be asked to come for job interviews than applicants with white-sounding names. And even when Bertrand and Mullen enhanced the resumes associated with black-sounding names so that they were stronger than the white resumes, whites still held an advantage in job callbacks. Another study demonstrated that when blacks and Asians' resumes are stripped of evidence of their racial or ethnic background, the candidates actually had greater odds of being invited for interviews. This was just as true for applications to firms that advertised their commitment to diversity as for those that did not. Of course, improved odds of reaching the interview stage do not mean that the racial gap in hiring gets closed afterward. A candidate's racial identity typically becomes obvious when they enter the room for the interview. Furthermore, researchers at the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that there were severe racial economic employment gaps at the upper end of the educational distribution. In a 2014 study, Janelle Jones and John Schmidt reported that blacks with engineering degrees have much higher unemployment rates than whites with similar degrees. The import of their findings can be challenged by the possibility that blacks and whites engineering degrees may not have been obtained from comparable schools. But a Bloomberg study on MBA recipients provides precisely that kind of evidence. The Bloomberg study reveals that blacks receiving MBAs from Harvard Business School between 2007 and 2009 started their careers earning about $5,000 less than their white peers with degrees from the same program. But by 2015, the racial pay gap for the Harvard MBA recipients had ballooned to a shocking $100,000 annually. S. Michael Gaddis's field experiment is another named study with false profiles submitted as applications for 1,000 positions advertised by employers. Gaddis paired Black-sounding named applicants whose degrees supposedly were from Harvard, Stanford, and Duke against white-sounding named applicants whose degrees were from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the University of California at Riverside, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, respectively. He found that the applicants with Black-sounding names with degrees from the higher cachet institutions were no more likely to receive favorable responses than applicants with the white-sounding names whose degrees were from the less selective institutions. Perversely, discrimination in the job market intensifies as Blacks become more credentialed. Jones and Schmidt, Gaddis, and reporter Natalie Kureff all found that greater educational attainment does not insulate Blacks from discrimination. Quite the opposite. No matter how much education Blacks acquire in quantity or quality, potential employers will not evaluate their credentials and experience on equal footing with those of whites. Indeed, the discriminatory differentials rise as Blacks attain higher levels of education.
The next passage that we'd like to share with you concerns the question of whether or not we can explain the kinds of disparities that we observe on the basis of dysfunctional behavior on the part of Blacks. And we'd like to examine the racial wealth gap as an entry point for trying to explore this issue. So on page 31 of our text, we say the following. One powerful example that challenges the thinking of those who prefer America's feel-good myth of equality is provided by a close analysis of wealth disparity in this country. Wealth is the best single indicator of the cumulative impact of white racism over time. Wealth, the difference between what we own and what we owe, or the difference between the value of our assets and our debts, or the net value of our property, is the economic measure that best captures individual, family, and household well-being. Wealth serves as a primary indicator of economic security. Wealthier families are better positioned to finance elite independent school and college education, access capital to start a business, finance expensive medical procedures, reside in higher amenity neighborhoods, exert political influence through campaign financing, purchase better counsel if confronted with an expensive legal system, leave a bequest, and or withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies. Wealth provides financial agency over one's life. Simply put, wealth gives individuals and families choice. It provides economic security to take risks and shield against financial loss. Data from the 2016 Survey of Consumer Finances indicates that median Black household net worth, $17,600, is only 1/10 of white net worth, $171,000. That means on average that for every dollar the middle white household holds in wealth, measured by assets like homes, cash savings, and retirement funds, the middle Black household possesses a mere 10 cents. Among Black households with positive net worth, there is a greater reliance on home ownership as a source of wealth than among white households. Customarily, we have assumed that equity in a home was a secure and stable source of wealth. But recent experience during the Great Recession has torpedoed that belief. The collapse of home ownership and equity value in homes has affected Black households adversely and disproportionately. Moreover, home ownership and total wealth do not track each other as closely as many Americans imagine. For example, a survey conducted in the Los Angeles metropolitan area in 2014-2015 demonstrates that the rate of African American home ownership, 42%, is slightly higher than that of the city's Asian Indians, 40%, an immigrant community consisting disproportionately of highly educated, affluent professionals. On the basis of home ownership rates, one might expect the two Los Angeles communities to have similar net worth. However, The median Asian Indian household net worth was $460,000, as opposed to only $4,000 for African Americans, less than 1% of the former. The difference appears to be due to far greater rates and levels of ownership of financial assets by Asian Indian households. 59% of Asian Indian households own stocks, mutual funds, and investment trusts, while only 22% of African American households own the same types of assets. The capacity even to enter markets for remunerative financial assets is contingent on having a significant endowment of wealth in the first place. From 2005 to 2009, an interval that captures the impact of the Great Recession, median household wealth, all assets minus all debt, the latter including mortgages, credit card balances, and other loans among Blacks, actually fell by a whopping 53%, compared with a drop of 16% among whites. Clearly, these disparities in Black and white wealth are not consistent with claims of any circumstance approximating racial economic equality. Some have suggested that the racial wealth gap is explained by Black profligacy, Blacks' unwillingness, allegedly, to commit to a careful plan of saving, and Blacks' ignorance about proper investment practices. A virtual cottage industry has developed to provide financial literacy to Black families, but it is striking that there is very little, if any, evidence to support the claim that Black saving behavior is the source of the enormous racial wealth gap.
So we continue with a number of other misperceptions regarding the source of the Black-white wealth gap. If we consider Black and white families with similar income levels, we discover no significant differences in saving rates, nor a difference in rates Blacks display, nor a difference in rates of return on their personal investments. In fact, in some income categories, Blacks display a higher rate of savings. Somehow, Blacks manage to have a savings profile comparable to whites with similar income levels, despite the fact that Blacks have more kin obligation because their relatives are more likely to be in need than those of comparably situated whites. These family obligations reduce the total income available for saving and wealth building. Nevertheless, the Black savings rate is comparable to the white savings rate at each level of household income. Nor do differences in family structure provide headway in explaining Black-white wealth inequality. Single white women with children have as high a median net worth as Black women with no children. Single white parents have more than 2 times the wealth, $35,000, as the median of married Black parents, $16,000. The professed economic benefits associated with having the ideal family type do not translate into closure of the racial wealth gap. Being a stable, married 2-parent Black family far from evens Black and white wealth levels. Furthermore, there are vast differences in wealth between Black and white women. For example, older, over 60 years of age, single Black women with a bachelor's degree have a median net worth of about $11,000, while single white women with a college degree in the same age range have $384,000 in median net worth. Single mothers have negligible wealth, but the racial difference still is palpable. White single mothers have a median net worth of $3,000, but Black single mothers have a median net worth of 0. While young adult, 20 to 29-year-old single white women who have completed college have a median net worth of $3,400, single Black women of a similar age and level of education have a median net worth of negative $11,000. That means they're in debt. A report on the racial wealth gap from Prosperity Now concludes the greatest socioeconomic disparities for most women of color are rooted in racial inequality, which is then worsened by smaller but significant gendered disparities. It follows that within the most economically disenfranchised racial and ethnic groups, such as Blacks and Latinos, gender disparities are usually much smaller than among whites. African American women and Latinas experience greater gender economic equality within their racial and ethnic groups. However, this parity is more an equality in economic disenfranchisement than an equality in economic well-being. The belief that Blacks lack motivation and effort is contradicted by the evidence on racial differences in educational attainment. For comparable levels of family socioeconomic status, Black youth obtain more years of schooling and credentials, including college degrees, than white youth. Moreover, unfortunately, motivation and effort are not enough to close the Black-white wealth gap. Data from both the Survey of Income and Program Participation and the Survey of Consumer Finances provides the facts. Black household heads with a college or university degree have about $10,000 less in median net worth than white household heads who never completed high school. Blacks who are working full-time have a lower median net worth than whites who are unemployed. Blacks in the third quintile of the income distribution have similar levels of median wealth as whites in the lowest quintile. That means that on average, Blacks whose incomes were about $60,000 in 2014 had a level of median wealth of about $22,000, while whites whose incomes were less than $26,000 had a median wealth of about $18,000. Blacks in the lowest quintile had a median wealth of a paltry $200.
We'll stop there and open the conversation for the questions and answers.
Thank you. So now we're going to transition to our discussion section. Some of you were kind enough to send me pictures as you were reading the book and to share some comments that you thought about as you were reading. And you can see a couple of them there. There were people who, after reading the introduction, it was very clear to them what the way forward was. And then if you look at the bottom comment, you see that one of our readers shared that there was a sense of having, a pretty good sense of awareness compared to fellow white citizens about the injustices that Black people had suffered. But then this book taught how painfully ignorant he had been to some extent, and how he wants to work harder for equality. And I'll let you all take a couple of moments to read these comments. These are verbatims from readers who have been reading the book. So I'll give you a moment to look at those.
Well, I think we have a confession of our own, which is before we started working on the book, a lot of the information that we now report in the book was not familiar to us. We know that, both of us never were taught material about this approach of understanding American history when we were in high school, and we were not taught this as college students. So when we started this project about 7 years ago or so, we thought that we knew quite a bit, but I think it's staggering how much more we were able to uncover and learn in the process of working on the book. So we're thrilled that the information that we've been able to assemble in the book is something that people are finding to be enlightening and useful.
Thank you. So now we have 10 questions from our readers that we wanted to share with you all and get your responses to. So here is our first question.
So the book cover is a photo from the Memorial Corridor at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. We had a chance to tour the memorial and also the Legacy Museum last June. And we're just incredibly moved by these objects that you see. So these are basically sculptural objects that are hanging from the ceiling. And they're not in alphabetical order, but they're organized by county. And what you see are the names of the counties, and when they were known, the names of the individuals, Black people who were lynched in those counties, and the dates when those lynchings occurred. And so as we were walking through them, it's a huge space. It's like an L-shaped memorial. We began to see clusters of names. Some of them may have one or two names, but some we were noticing, like in a 1 or 2 or even a 3-day period, you might see 8 or 9 names. And we thought, I wonder, was this a massacre? that was happening. Like, why were so many, Black people being lynched, on these, on these 2-3 days? And so we would then go to archival research, and in fact, that's what we found. For a number of the markers, Elaine, Arkansas, for example, and Wilmington, North Carolina, in the county, Hanover County, thank you. The monument, the memorial would list maybe say 8 names, or 9 or 10 or 12 names, and it would say, and 200 others, or 300 others, because they were unable, at the time, no one kept a good record of, the legions of Black people who were murdered.
Yeah, that's because Black lives were meaningless. Yeah, so why keep a count?
But it was very powerful to us to see this, and we were very, very happy to be able to have that image, Grace, from Here to Equality.
Now, there's actually a different image on the audiobook, which is actually a picture of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. And we like that one also as an important way of transmitting a message about the social justice mission that's associated with reparations.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are the goals of reparations and how would you prioritize them? For example, an award for damages, providing money for Black people to use to help overcome deficits from past inequities, leveling the playing field on a permanent basis, or as Ta-Nehisi Coates said in his Atlantic article, America's maturation out of the childhood myth of its innocence into a wisdom worthy of its founders, or other?
So I'll start. The previous participant had identified ARC in the margin in their notes, and we define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for grievous injustices. So acknowledgement constitutes admission of culpability on the part of the perpetrators for those atrocities. Redress is the act of restitution for heinous acts of the perpetrator. And closure is the victim's agreement that the perpetrator has met the debt owed, with no further claims forthcoming, unless either the old claims are revisited or new atrocities are committed. So, this is the basis that we start with. But we're, as Sandy mentioned earlier, we're looking not just at the harms from the period of slavery, but also Jim Crow and White Terror, and certainly the White Terror has continued, right, into the present. So maybe we're going to focus coming down this list here, to talk about the forms that reparation might take.
Well, I think that, our emphasis is on the one central fact, which is Black Americans are about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess about 2.6% of the nation's wealth. This means in turn that if we were to look at the average at the mean instead of the median, the average Black household would have $800,000 less in net worth than the average white household. And we think that this is what really captures the economic consequences of the full trajectory of racial injustice in the United States. And so we prioritize elimination of the racial wealth differential as something that must be accomplished by a reparations program. But if you go to that last item on the list, where there's a reference to Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, I think another way of interpreting what's said there is the importance of addressing America's memory problem. And Kirsten created this term that we use in the text, dismemory. And I'd love to have her talk about that a bit.
So, dismemory is this active strategy to create a false memory. And we see this in these monuments to Confederate rebels, traitors, across the country. Why is that? We don't see, Nazi figures across Germany. We don't see, any of the, we don't see Saddam Hussein statues, in the U.S. Why do we have these Confederate monuments? These are folks who were traitors to the Union, who lost the war. But we learned that it's not just a coincidence that these memorials to the lost cause exist. There was a very determined effort on the part, especially of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the American Revolution. And these women were very actively engaged in reviewing history books, especially for grade schools. They identified authors whose take on the Civil War was more to their liking, which is to say, tomes that downplayed the role that the preservation of slavery had in the war, or if Black people were mentioned at all in the context of the period of slavery, we were, Black people were referred to as lazy or stupid or happy to be enslaved. There was very little, if anything, about agency or resilience, and they were very powerful. These women's groups, they courted authors, they attended educational associations and conferences. They used their influence to blackball authors whose interpretations of American history did not agree with what they wanted to have taught. And when that didn't work, they wrote their own textbooks. And unfortunately, many school districts use those textbooks for over 60, 70 years. So I certainly came along, when I came along in school, I had textbooks that had been confirmed by those groups. And many other people did as well. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas. And, they were extraordinarily effective. They interviewed the Civil War veterans. And in fact, those collections, their memorabilia, are among the first collections in many states' historical collections. So they were armed and ready, to do that work, and they were extremely effective in the process.
I would only add that there's that lost cause ideology has produced a set of outright lies about American history. So one example is the claim that I've frequently seen made by pundits on the air that only 2% of white Southerners owned slaves. That's absolutely fallacious. In states like South Carolina and Mississippi, more than half of the white Southerners lived in families that owned slaves. Okay. Another lie is the claim that most slaves, or a large proportion of slaves, were folks who were white. And this usually falls under the meme of Irish slaves. I suspect some of you have encountered that. That's also a disingenuous claim. And a third one that I would mention is an argument that the reparations debt has already been paid by the 600,000 lives that were lost during the course of the Civil War, despite the fact that half of those 600 folks who were fatalities were fighting to preserve slavery, and despite the fact that there was a significant wave of participation by Black soldiers on the Union Army side. So we did not have a situation in which essentially Black folks were handed their emancipation as a gift from white Americans. Blacks were actively involved in the process of self-liberation.
Thank you. Question number 3. What is your perspective on a contemporary need for deconfederation?
So this is another term that I came up with for this conversation. I think this is absolutely an essential piece of a reparations program. You know, the Confederacy is, you know, it appears in our culture in ways that we almost don't even recognize. You know, I was astounded to see photographs of the Confederate flag that American military personnel had erected in Vietnam or in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's like, wow, what's going on here? You know, the group, I think they just changed their names, the Dixie Chicks, you know, whose politics I think are fairly progressive, but they, you know, were still calling themselves the Dixie Chicks until very recently. You know, we absolutely need an education campaign that is comprehensive and that addresses, you know, this active, you know, that sort of addresses two things. You know, one is this inaccurate history, and the other piece of it is what is the work that inaccurate history is doing. And you know, the work has been about you know, projecting Black people as cognitively inferior. The work has been about you know, projecting Black people as unable or unwilling to help themselves and not deserving, right? We also don't talk at all about the kinds of support that white Americans have received from the federal government at the same time that Blacks were denied those supports, whether it was land grants, whether it was assistance from Small Businesses Administration or from the Department of Agriculture. There's the whole series, the GI Bill, there's a whole litany of government programs that Black people benefited from in very small measure compared to the kind of largesse that whites received.
Thank you. Next question. Do you feel that systemic and attitude changes need to be made to ensure that reparations results in ongoing equality rather than just providing a short-term compensation? And if so, what levels need to be in place before we make reparation payments?
So we think that taking the step of building Black assets to a level sufficient to eliminate racial wealth differences is such a dramatic step that we can't even conceive of it as some form of short-term compensation. It is a measure that would alter the economic landscape of the United States in terms of the capacity of Black Americans to have the material foundation for full citizenship. Now, that said, we believe strongly that the way you have to do this is through congressional legislation. And for congressional legislation to be enacted to support a reparations project, it would require significant popular support across the American public. It would not require everybody to stop being a racist, but it would require a sufficient number of folks to acknowledge their personal racism and to say that this is the moral imperative for American society. And so as a consequence, I think you would have had had a sufficient degree of attitudinal change in the first place for a reparations program to become a reality. And that's why I think we both say that the important struggle in the present moment is continuing to try to win over hearts and minds to the reparations cause.
Thank you. The next question says, the latest polls I saw last week showed that 75% of Americans are opposed to reparations. This is a moment of fundamental police reform, or finally acknowledging structural racism across American society. I would not want the opposition to reparations to destroy the potential of fundamental, long overdue change. I fear the 2020 presidential election could be a referendum on reparations, which we would lose, as opposed to what it should be, a referendum on the white supremacist, racist current president, which we must win. I would love to hear the author's perspective on this idea.
Well, I think I want to go back to the end of the Civil War, when the newly emancipated folk were promised 40-acre land grants. And the president in that moment, Andrew Johnson, reversed that policy. And Andrew Johnson was a Republican, although in that moment, the individuals who were in primary political opposition to Black equality in the United States were members of the Democratic Party. So, you know, from our perspective, there's, in a sense, a plague on both houses. And we would argue further that as horrendous as the current president is, Andrew Johnson was the worst president the United States ever had, because a consequence of his decision was to create this wall of inequality that persists to the present moment. So I'm actually not at all convinced that the re-election of the evil Trump would be any worse than the presence of Andrew Johnson as president of the United States. What we do need to make sure happens in the 2020 election is that the Senate and the House the House go into, or the House continues to be in Democratic Party control, and that the Senate shifts to Democratic Party control away from Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. So I'm more concerned about what happens in the congressional election than I am in the presidential election. I certainly hope that Donald Trump loses, but I would not view that as big a disaster as if as a disaster that we would have if the Senate remained in Republican hands.
I say this too. We take small consolation in the fact that the poll data says now that 75% of Americans are opposed to reparations. In 2000, it was 96%. So, you know, it's moving in the right direction. It's also the case that the majority of millennials support reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So, yeah, we want to look at that half full cup.
Definitely. The next question: are there lessons from reparations programs in Germany, Canada, and the U.S. for Japanese internment that are applicable to reparations for descendants of slaves?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have looked in some detail, especially at Germany and Japanese American internment reparations. The German case, as many of you know, was to provide restitution to the Jews who were the victims of the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust. And there are a couple of things that are really important to focus on. So these funds that Germany, the Republic of Germany did pay, went both to individuals, to survivors and to their families and descendants, but also to the state of Israel. You know, Black Americans do not have a country that is arguing and negotiating on its behalf. Now, we have wondered, you know, what it would be like if there was an African Union, and if, you know, if that organization were to lobby lobby U.S. Congress for a program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, and also to say, and until you make that happen, we will not allow American companies to come here, right? So that might be one way that Black Americans would receive some other assistance outside the U.S. But reparations to the Holocaust victims continue to this day. And in fact, as recently as 2012 and 2016, the numbers of individuals who are eligible to receive reparations has increased. In fact, the sentiment among the groups who are who are in charge of these disbursements is that we need, as these people are getting older, we need to be as generous to them as we possibly can. So, for example, at one point, one had to demonstrate, one had to prove that you've been in a ghetto for 18 months in order to receive reparations. That time frame was lowered to 12 months, and now it's 6. Jews who were in France who were remanded to Germany previously were not eligible for reparations, but they are today. So there, you had 2 very strong leaders working publicly, and many others working behind the scenes to make that happen. And we don't have, there are a number of advocates from within the Black community who are advocating reparations, but we don't have as many powerful white allies who are publicly pushing this agenda. We can start maybe talking a bit about Japanese American internment case.
So I think one of the most significant dimensions of the Japanese American case is the restitution took the form of direct payments to eligible recipients. And interestingly enough, no one complained about that in the way in which they complain about the idea of making direct payments to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I would also add that when the Japanese American case came forward, no one said, well, what about this group, or what about this other group that's deserving? No one put a piggyback effect on the Japanese American case for reparations, nor should they have done so. But unfortunately, we frequently hear that in the context of thinking about Black American reparations. I think recently, presidential candidate Joe Biden said it should be, he might consider reparations if Native Americans were included. Well, we certainly think that there may well be a very serious case for Native American reparations, but it's not the same one. The Black American claim is for the material conditions that would enable us to have full citizenship in the United States. And the Native American claim conventionally has been for sovereignty rather than citizenship.
I want to say to the specifics of the Japanese American claims. So you had 4 elected officials who were very powerful, who were of Asian descent, whose involvement greatly pushed this case to the forefront. And there was also a citizens group called the Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, that was also very engaged. And they had 3 major goals for reparations: a $25,000 payment to each internee. And the idea there was a base price of $20,000, and which was like $15 per internee for each day that they had been interned. Ultimately, they were given $20,000. They also sought a congressional apology and the establishment of a trust fund to provide educational materials and guidance about the injustice. Now, that's an interesting point. The budget for the educational program was ultimately gutted 90%. And as a result, very few Americans are really aware, A, that Japanese Americans were interned during World War II, and that they did receive reparations. So one of the lessons, from that for a Black reparations program is we absolutely need a robust education program that not only unravels this whole deconfederation, conversation, but also assures that at least 3 generations of Americans are taught American history accurately and taught, I mean, hopefully into perpetuity, but at least 3 continuous generations would have a more accurate understanding of what this country is about, how we got here in the first place.
I'd like to make a comment about the Canadian case because I'm not entirely sure who the reader is, which case the reader is talking about. I'm not sure if this concerns Native American kids who were put into these schools where they were taken away from their families, or whatever compensation they subsequently received, which I think was quite modest at best, or the reader is talking about the formation of a separate province for indigenous people. I'm not sure, but I just have never really heard about any significant reparations program in the Canadian context.
Thank you. Our next question is, what additional reading about reparations do you recommend?
Well, yeah. So there's lots of valuable reading. Where do you want to start?
So some of this would be looking at the work that's gone before. There's a fabulous book by one of our heroes, Mary Frances Berry, who produced a profile, a biography of Callie House, who was a very early proponent of Black reparations. She created an organization that had over 300,000 members, and they were advocating for pensions for Blacks who had fought in the Union, but also formerly enslaved. Her book is called "My Faith is Black is True." Yes, that'd be the top of my list.
Yeah.
And then
I think the book "They Were Her Property" by Stephanie Jones Rogers is valuable. And then I guess most people know that about a day or so ago, Nicole Hannah-Jones had a major article that will appear in print in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday, but it's available online now. And I have to say it tracks the argument that we make for reparations pretty closely, but it's a shorter read. And then, selfishly, should we recommend our Roosevelt Institute paper?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can go online and just Google Roosevelt Institute and our names, and it will show up. I think it's called "Resurrecting the Promise of 40 Acres, the Imperative for Black Reparations, or Reparations for Black Americans."
Yeah. Somebody asked in the chat, did they get the title correct? And it is correct. "My Face is Black is True" is the title of Mary Frances Berry's book. It's terrific.
Thank you. Next question. Please expound on your statement. Moreover, in our estimation, the climate for the acceptance of a reparations program has never been better.
Yeah. Well, when we first started the book, we were hoping
7 years ago.
Yeah, because our book, we started working on the book roughly around the same time as Ta-Nehisi Coates's article in The Atlantic came out. Yeah, we had started a little bit earlier, because when he came to UNC and Duke, we were talking to him about that we were working on a book, and he said he had an article that he was doing on reparations. So, but at that point, there really was very little attention being drawn to reparations in the United States. I think that maybe the most attention that had occurred, particularly on college campuses, took place around 2000 when a person who was hostile towards reparations, David Horowitz, circulated an advertisement in a variety of college newspapers with 10 reasons why black reparations was a bad idea. And it actually stirred a lot of activity around reparations, but that was eradicated or erased when 9/11 took place. And there was no significant conversation about reparations subsequent to that until Ta-Nehisi Coates' article came out. And then that level of attention died away, I think, within a year or so. So we were hoping that when our book would come out, it would spark a renewal of the conversation. But it turned out that it didn't have to do that, because for whatever reason, in 2019, you had presidential candidates actually uttering the term reparations and talking about the potential for passing legislation for a study commission for reparations, HR 40. And so we had the sense that there was the greatest national conversation about reparations that we'd ever had since the Reconstruction era. And so as a consequence, that's such a different climate that it appears to be the most propitious moment to try to move forward with the idea of reparations. Even if the polls indicate that there's still a significant number of white Americans who are opposed, the conversation is at a completely different level from what it was before 2019.
I wanted to say, Google to the rescue. I was just looking up the dates of when Ta-Nehisi Coates came to Duke, and that was March 2014.
Okay.
And so we had begun this work in 2012. Is that the year Stanford? Or 11?
No,
2010, 11.
2011,
Yeah.
2012. So it took a long time for us to produce this book.
We spent a year at Stanford University, 2010, 11. And that was 11, 12, you're right, 11, 12. But that was ostensibly to begin we thought we were going to completely write the book then, but that didn't quite happen.
No.
But at any rate, it was several years before.
I mean, one of the problems we had is that as each time we were thinking we were putting the book to bed, we discovered something new that we thought was vital to include. And finally, we had to just say, we'll take our chances. There's going to be other information that will be of value to the book, but at some point, we've got to put it out there in the world.
And thank you for doing that.
Thank
Number
you.
9, in part 1, chapter 1 chronicles a political history of America's Black reparations movement. Given these learnings, what are the greatest threats to advancing a program of Black reparations as defined in part 6, chapter 13?
Well, I think one of the dangers is reflected in previous periods where reparations efforts have been brought forward, but they have not been successful. And I think that one of the dangers is not having full unanimity on the part of Black Americans themselves. Callie House's efforts, for example, were never supported by a large swath of the better positioned or more established Black Americans at the time. I'm not sure she would have succeeded had they supported her, but I think it would have made the prospects for success greater. So I think from our perspective, one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we have created a case that's sufficiently persuasive, not exclusively for white Americans, but also for the overwhelming majority of Black Americans. I think at the present moment, maybe 30 to 35% of Black Americans are not on board for reparations. And that's far too high a percentage.
And our last question, given all the very recent changes in our world, do you have any updates which you would like to share this evening to your ideas in the book about the best plan for making reparations happen?
The best plans, but we have actually before, or I guess as the pandemic was becoming more of a known factor. The mayor, our local mayor, Durham, North Carolina, Steve Schewel, resolved that our city council would advocate for a national reparations program for Black Americans. And, this was quite extraordinary. He included it in his State of the City address in, I believe, early March of this year. And the idea is that, they would form a coalition that would be comprised not only of municipalities, but also cultural organizations and communities of faith, colleges and universities, but also corporations who would petition, but even more importantly, lobby Congress to pass H.R. 40 and to enact a program of reparations. I think the combination of the pandemic and just the horrors of, how it attacks the body, and but also the revelations of which communities are suffering most as a consequence of, poverty, basically, has been eye-opening for a lot of people. And then the horror of, watching George Floyd's life just drain away from his body, as you watch helplessly, has really touched people in a way that might not have happened had we not been, many of us, at home with devices in hand. The internet has made the transmission of information at rapid speeds possible, something that just could not have happened before. So, I have been amazed at the outpouring of grieving, the outpouring of outrage, the outpouring of just astonishment at what Black Americans have been experiencing for centuries. I think it's a good thing that more people here in this country and around the world are realizing that this is not just something that Black people have made up. This is very real, and it continues. And I would like to think that the moral compass is swinging in the right direction, and that reparations indeed is much more likely. We have seen that it's quite possible for Congress to, very quickly appropriate large amounts of money to people who need it, with our CARES Act. So we know that
and to people who don't need it.
And certainly during the previous recession, checks were cut. We have the capacity to make these funds available and to do so without seriously affecting taxpayers. The question is, do we have the will? Will we sustain this interest? Will we sustain these concerns? Will we, continue to push, and to make our elected officials accountable? That's the real question.
Thank you. So that concludes our pre-established questions. And Zane, I'd love your help here as we transition to our final 20 minutes. Would you unmute yourself? And Zane, if people have entered questions in the chat, would you select some to read now? If there are no questions in the chat, then would you let us know? And then maybe we can ask people to raise their hand, and then we can allow them to ask a question. And Zane, you're still on mute, by the way.
Okay, finally off of mute. I'm going to start. I have a question first. Thank you very much, William and Kirsten, for taking this time. We truly appreciate it. My question was, me and my friends have talked about reparations for years, but a lot of people like my age have always get the picture of that Chappelle Show episode. So just wanted to know, do you think monetary reparations would be effective at all? Is that what you're fighting for? Or do you think it would be more suitable for another form of reparations, whether it's a business loan or home loan, free college, or land in South Carolina, or what are your thoughts on this?
The goal for us, the primary goal, is to eliminate the wealth gap. And that can only be done with a redistribution of wealth, period. All these other things are lovely, but they're not going to move the needle on the wealth gap.
Yeah, I actually, in 2016, I endorsed Bernie Sanders' plan for zero tuition for students who would be attending public universities in the United States. But I certainly didn't think that would do much about the racial wealth gap. And I did a report called Running the Numbers on Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, in which I tried to demonstrate that a wide variety of these policies would do very little to do that. I think frequently we can confuse income and wealth. And a lot of these policies might well have a significant impact on people's income level, but it will not have a significant impact on their wealth level. And wealth is not determined by income. Wealth is determined primarily by the transfer of resources across generations, the intergenerational transfer of resources, not exclusively by inheritances, but also by what we call in vivo transfers, which are the less visible transfers that take place while the donors are still living. And this could include paying for your kids' college education so that they leave college debt-free. It could include providing support for the down payment on a home mortgage. It could include just giving your child a car, or helping them purchase a home by making a significant payment on the home in addition to the down payment support. It could involve transferring a business to the next generation. So these are the ways in which wealth is accumulated, and you do not offset those forms of accumulation by these general kinds of policies that would be beneficial to all Americans. So you need to go this route. Now, in a couple of my papers, I've actually talked about the Chappelle effect, the possibility that a transfer of resources to Blacks could result in an expenditure process that would lead to the money all going back to white-owned corporations or something like that. And that's a possibility. But it would require Blacks to receive the funds and spend virtually all of the funds at one time. I don't think that that's likely to occur, but if you are really nervous about that, you could inaugurate a plan of financial training or financial management for folks in advance of the receipt of the reparations. Where Kirsten and I call it
Pre-reparations.
Right. But the other thing you could do is alter the form of the payout. It doesn't have to be a cash payment. It could take the form of an endowment or a trust account. And in that case, it would be less liquid and people would not be able to spend it immediately.
Okay, great. Thank you. So give people money. That's what you're thinking. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we have some more questions.
That's what we always do with reparations. Why should it be any different for Black Americans?
Okay. We have some other questions from the audience. We have one from Jeremy. Jeremy says, as we move further into late stages of capitalism, with wealth inequality further exacerbated between wealthy and non-wealthy, all races, will the obstacles for ARC compound under capitalism demise?
So there's a lot going on there to unpackage. first of all, the presumption that the society is,
I don't know about that.
yeah,
But
I mean, there's some sort of, yeah, that's complicated. Let me say this. There's no question that general wealth inequality is an enormous problem in the United States. And as a consequence, I've personally been an advocate of a program that I call a baby bonds program, which would be for all newborn infants in the United States to receive a trust account from the federal government that would be predicated on the level of their parents' wealth. I think this is a great idea. I think it's something that could help mitigate some of the excesses of the huge amounts of wealth inequality that we observe today and provide a wider base of opportunity for all Americans. That's a universal program. Reparations is different. Reparations intends to target the specific wealth gap that exists between Black and white Americans and to eliminate it. And that requires a reparations program which would be specific to Black Americans. And so, I'm in favor of both. I think that, however we describe what stage of capitalism American society is in, there's always going to be a struggle for justice. And so let's struggle for justice.
Okay, great. I'm going to unmute William Watkins now. William Watkins is one of the top dogs at the Urban League in Boston. So I'm going to let Will say a few words now. I know he has a question.
Okay. Good evening to you all. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you because you didn't know that at this time, that this was a timely discussion. I've read The Debt when I was younger, and I can tell you your book is totally different from that space, because when I read The Debt, I was angry. It was like, you owe me something. But I could not articulate what it was. And this document that you put together really articulates that. I'm the director of workforce development for the Urban League. So I look at these numbers all the time, and we're always talking about the wealth gap. And the McKinsey and Company put out a great report, I believe back in April, about the wealth gap for Blacks and how important it was for America to deal with the wealth gap. And I've heard, the pundits on the other side, Glenn Laurie and all those kind of people talking about why we shouldn't go down this path. But I want to say thank you, because if we don't take this moment right now, where, I like to tell people, God gave us 2020. He stopped the entire world so we can focus on the people that need the most help. And I can tell you, I'm not going to be so concerned about if you gave me $100,000. I'm not going to be concerned about Ray and what he's going to do with his $100,000.
Or Pookie.
Or Pookie, right? It just puts us all on an equal playing field. When I'm looking at reports that says when you go into a Black and brown neighborhood, and there's fees on top of fees when you go into a bank, and you go into a white neighborhood, they don't have all of these fees. It eats into the poor man's dollars. He has to keep $50 in the bank account in order to keep the bank account open. And they become unbankable because they don't want to put the money into the bank account. But when we looked at COVID, we all didn't know who was essential workers, and that was the same for the slaves. They were essential workers. In this modern day time, we're the same essential workers, and we're the ones who were dying or dying in this COVID crisis. But I just want to thank you, because I am a champion of yours. I have been talking this language for some time, but you have given me that sweet spot. And that sweet spot is that wealth gap. I know if I had $100,000 and I put in a post about Henrietta Woods, you need to look her up because she got reparations.
Right.
She only got $2,500, but she was able to create a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a fighter pilot. She was able to send her boys to schools. Her son became the first lawyer at Northwestern University because she was on an equal playing field.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just want to thank you. That's all I want to do. That's all I want to do. Just thank you.
We appreciate
Thank you
it.
so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Watkins.
And thanks for the work you do.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, William. We have a question from Neil Osborne in the chat. Neil is the immediate past president of this NAACP branch, and now he works as a diversity coordinator for one of our local municipalities. Neil's question is, do you think the concept of basic income entering into mainstream conversation, you know, with Andrew Yang and all that, does it help the argument for reparations or does it like distract from it?
I think it's a distraction. In fact, I'm actually an advocate of a federal job guarantee. And I don't think that's mutually exclusive from a universal basic income. I think we would have a good world or a better world if we had both a federal job guarantee and a universal basic income. But I prefer a world with a federal job guarantee and no universal basic income to one with a universal basic income and no federal job guarantee. And here's why. The universal basic income is actually potentially a mechanism to eliminate the social safety net altogether, because that, I think, is the intention of many of their advocates, particularly the more libertarian-minded advocates of the universal basic income. And then the second issue, from my perspective, is the actual possibility that employers might actually reduce wages as a consequence of the existence of a universal basic income. That's something that can't happen with the federal job guarantee, because the federal job guarantee would ensure that everyone would have the opportunity to get public sector employment at non-poverty wages with a benefits package that is similar to the benefits package that's made available to all federal civil servants. The private sector wouldn't be able to hire anybody unless it did at least that. It's a way of enforcing a floor on compensation for all Americans, regardless of what type of employment they have. And so I think universal basic income just does not accomplish as much in isolation as a federal job guarantee. The last comment I'd like to make is a universal basic income is about income. It's not about wealth. And we're talking about trying to close the racial wealth gap. So even proposing that that's something that would accomplish the same goal is a distraction.
You might want to say something about comparing, distinguishing income from wealth.
Yeah, it's critical that we don't confuse income and wealth, where income is a flow concept that's primarily associated with what you earn. But wealth is a stock concept that is primarily associated with your personal property. And it includes items that you could, in principle, carry with you across time and potentially transfer to subsequent generations in a way in which it's very difficult to do with income alone. You have to convert your income into wealth if you can. And the only people who can do that very effectively are people who already have relatively high levels of wealth in the first place.
Thank you for your question, Neil. Does anybody else have any questions?
Time for one more question, I believe.
One more question. Raise your hand feature, type in the chat, wave your hand, get my attention, one and above.
Oh.
Okay, looks like William has a question again.
What I know you heard of Johnson. He has come out. He was once the owner of BET, and he talked about $350,000. What do you think about his concept of reparations?
Yeah, no, $14 trillion. That's right.
He said 350,000.
Yeah, that's per person.
Oh, per person.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so in the estimates that we've generated about how much it would take to eliminate the racial wealth gap, we have a slightly lower number. We say it's somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 12 trillion dollars, but I think Bob Johnson talks about $14 trillion. We're all in favor of higher numbers rather than lower. So, but I'm not sure about the details of how he actually wants to execute it. And we want to be sure that this is designed in such a way that direct payments are made to eligible recipients. I know that Robert Smith has talked about some sort of program to build Black businesses, but we're very nervous about that approach. We think the individual eligible recipients should receive the funds and have discretion to use it as they see fit. Perhaps they would want to invest in a Black business. It's fine. That's their discretion. But we want to be sure that the reparations program looks very similar to the way in which reparations have conventionally been handled through direct payments to eligible recipients.
Thank you very much. I think we had one more question. Sue, do you still have a question?
Yeah, given the extent to which housing, to the extent to which a house is a large percentage of the wealth held by most Americans, and given the systematic discrimination in the ability to purchase a house, let alone buy a house of significant value over the years, I'm curious why you haven't put more of an emphasis on access to just an integrated housing world in this country.
You know, if a program of reparations was enacted, Black people could buy whatever, you know, they could buy a house of their choosing for the most part, right? They wouldn't need to wait on some other program to do so.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's the beauty of receiving a direct payment, that you could decide whether you wanted to buy a house, if you wanted to invest in a franchise, if you wanted to save the money for your progeny,
or do some of all of that.
Do some of all of that. You know, you could do so because that was your choice. Now, maybe you want to speak to, you know, the difficulties with the current difficulties with the valuations of Black housing is owned by Black people.
Yeah, so Blacks have a lower rate of home ownership, but among the homes that Blacks own, their valuation is lower. I think that means that we do have to continue to address discriminatory effects that confine people to particular communities. I don't think we've ever said that reparations solves every single problem. I mean, a critical problem that we don't think closing the racial wealth gap will do much about is police behavior, anti-Black violence that the police conduct. That requires a very different set of policies, including getting rid of qualified immunity for the police. But on the other hand, as Kirsten said, if Black folks were wealthier, then they would have a greater range of options in terms of purchasing homes, even in the midst of a discriminatory environment. And you probably would have a situation in which in all Black neighborhoods, there would be a greater level of appreciation of homes as a consequence of the higher level of wealth that's possessed by Black residents there. But you're absolutely correct that if we're concerned about residential segregation, that's not something that is completely resolved by closing the racial wealth gap.
Well, thank you. And that brings us to the end of our hour and a half together. As they say, time flies when you're having fun. And we had a great time this evening. I want to give thanks and appreciation and gratitude for all of the work that has led to this beautiful offering in the name of our ancestors. I can get very emotional about this, truth be told. Thank you so much, Dr. Darity, and thank you so much, Kirsten.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for organizing this.
And for having us.
We're thrilled to participate with your community.
Thank you all for your good questions. It's very thoughtful.
Thank you. Thank you to the community. And in the chat box, I've put a couple of hyperlinks. I've put hyperlinks to our branch NAACP website. I put hyperlinks to the Twitter of Dr. Sandy Darity, which is an active, fun place to be, and also the Twitter for our own branch. And I encourage you all to participate. Now, what I'd like to do, I haven't tried this before in Zoom, is I did do a little bit of a quick poll. And so if you all could bear with me for one moment, I would like to launch the poll. You should be seeing it now. There's a poll question.
Very nice.
Okay, so I'm going to leave that up there for a couple of minutes. I like the direction of this. Okay, I like the direction of this. Okay, and so keep polling, give me your answers, and if you happen to say affirmative, I will be emailing you. Okay, and my email, you all should have it because it was in your registration email. It's my first name, Chiffon@gmail.com. And so with that, I'm going to count to 3 and I'm going to end the poll. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to even share the results. Hopefully you can see it. Hopefully you can see the poll results. So 89% of you would be willing to participate in lobbying activities to advocate for reparations for Black Americans. And for me, that is a perfect way to end our time together. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.